Commission has endeavored to cover all sorts of violations of international law and human rights law thoroughly, independently, and impartially. We would welcome the possibility of visiting the country and having a response to our requests of information from the government. We also welcome the questions of the Czech Republic, Romania, and others for recommendations to prevent further widespread human rights violations, since there are critical predictors of violence that are present in this situation. On this point, our mission echoes what has been said by many in this council. Our call is for unconditional ceasing of all hostilities, for peace, for engaging in the systematic legal and institutional reforms that would allow equal and inclusive participation in decision-making, including in peace negotiations. Given the systematic discrimination patterns entrenched in the Iranian legal system, we underscore the need of having women, minorities, and youth at any negotiation tables. We note that there is an extensive list of recommendations in our reports on issues of protection and accountability, and we want to highlight some immediate measures to support victims, journalists, and doctors, including the establishment of pathways for humanitarian visas and timely medical treatment, supporting NGOs, including those that work with persons that are detained, ensuring the protection of Iranians at risk of transnational repression, calling for the urgent release of those arbitrarily in prison, including Narges Mohammadi, human rights defenders and activists, calling on the respect of the integrity of healthcare professionals who must be able to treat patients without interference or punishment, support accountability mechanisms domestically and internationally, including through financial support.
Mr. Vice President, my fellow experts and I are especially alarmed, as you would have heard, about the implications for civilian and civilian infrastructure. The toll on civilians and innocents is already intolerable, and it's mounting. We have seen figures of 1,300 individuals killed, including 200 children under the age of 12, 200 women, 9,000 injuries recorded. We've seen 18 attacks on healthcare in Iran, 8 deaths amongst health workers in Iran, and 2 in Israel. We've seen reports of 20 schools having been damaged in Iran, and we've also seen cultural heritage sites that have been hit and massive disruptions to civilian lives. We've seen up to 3 million individuals fleeing their homes to seek safety. And we're also particularly concerned that there have been attacks launched by the Islamic Republic of Iran affecting energy infrastructure in neighboring countries and strikes resulting in killings of civilians. We've seen reports of at least 17 people having been killed in the Gulf countries through these attacks. And at least 12 people have been killed by attacks in Israel, according to media reports. And that's why the mission has stressed the importance of ending conflict and seeking justice other than through war. Justice Robert Jackson, who's the chief prosecutor for the United States at Nuremberg, spoke painfully about this. He criticized the resort to war as an aggrieved party. He said that all other methods, persuasion, propaganda, economic competition, diplomacy, these were open to an aggrieved country, but aggressive warfare was outlawed. And he made his position clear. He said, our position is that whatever grievances a nation may have, however objectionable it finds the status quo, aggressive warfare is not a legal means for settling those grievances or for altering those conditions, close quote. And that is why the mission has stressed repeatedly that it is essential to preserve evidence of crimes and abuses by all parties, and it has firmly stressed that justice and change must be pursued through lawful accountability and not through violence.
Muchas gracias. Aquí termina este diálogo interactivo. Deseo dar las gracias a la relatora especial y a los miembros de la misión de investigación por su participación. Ahora haremos una breve pausa antes de escuchar las actualizaciones orales del Alto Comisionado sobre la República Popular Democrática de Corea y sobre la República Bolivariana de Venezuela, seguidas de un debate general sobre el tema 4. Excelencias, distinguidos participantes, ahora procederemos a la presentación de las actualizaciones orales del Alto Comisionado sobre la República Popular Democrática de Corea y sobre la República Bolivariana de Venezuela. Solicito, por favor, guardar silencio mientras se desarrolla la sesión. Es un placer para mí dar la palabra al señor Volker Turk, Alto Comisionado de las Naciones Unidas para los Derechos Humanos, para que presente las actualizaciones orales. Adelante, por favor.
Muchas gracias, señor vicepresidente, distinguished delegates. Since my last update, the population of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea has been subjected to further repression and isolation. Fundamental rights are severely curtailed, including freedom of expression, the right to information, freedom of movement, as well as access to food and health care. Families of the disappeared in the Republic of Korea, Japan, and other countries continue to seek answers from the DPRK without success. Separate families cannot contact each other. People who are forcibly repatriated to the DPRK are subjected to serious human rights violations and prolonged detention. I again urge all governments to stop forcibly repatriating DPRK nationals. The 9th Congress of the Workers' Party of Korea, held last month, prioritized economic development, but with an increased focus on military capabilities. Security built solely around military strength is fragile and risks escalating conflict. It also leads to violations of human rights, as we see in the DPRK, from repression and forced labor to the diversion of resources that are desperately needed for social services and sustainable development. Real security comes through meaningful engagement, dialogue, and cooperation grounded in respect for human rights and international law. As I highlighted last September, there are pathways for the DPRK to engage with the human rights ecosystem to build trust and confidence towards lasting peace. We therefore encourage the DPRK's participation in international human rights mechanisms, most recently with the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in August 2025. Mr. Vice President, I regret to say that accountability for the grave violations in DPRK, which in some cases may amount to crimes against humanity, is extremely limited. There has been no progress on referring the situation in the DPRK to the International Criminal Court, nor were any criminal investigations opened over the past year in other jurisdictions. However, there has been progress on forms of accountability led by victims, and my office is central to this work. Our team in Seoul collects, analyzes, and preserves evidence for use in current and future accountability processes. Our work has been used by plaintiffs and courts, most recently in January of this year, when the Tokyo District Court held the DPRK government responsible for human rights violations suffered by 4 victims and awarded damages. As some of these crimes recede into the past, it is even more urgent to document their physical, psychological, and socioeconomic consequences for victims and their families. Over the past year, we have worked to realize victims' rights in several different ways. We interviewed 120 escapees and analyzed the testimony of over 300 more who escaped over the past decade. We held hundreds of consultations with individuals and with victims' groups. We provided technical assistance to victims' associations on non-judicial forms of accountability, including reparations and truth-telling initiatives. We also supported these groups in submitting information to the special procedure bodies of this Council. And we raised the profile of the human rights situation in the DPRK and increased public understanding by holding several public sessions where victims testified in the presence of diplomats and the international media. I fully acknowledge that these steps are insufficient compared with the scale of the violations. But for individual victims, they can mean everything. Never underestimate the value of enabling people to tell their stories, creating a permanent record of their suffering, and publicly acknowledging them as victims. Mr. Vice President, we have produced 24 reports on the situation in the DPRK since the Commission of Inquiry reported to this Council in 2014. They are a litany of repression that goes back decades. It is imperative that the situation in the DPRK remains firmly on the agenda of the international community, including this Council. I urge states to seek a referral to the ICC and to exercise extraterritorial and universal jurisdiction. Our repository of evidence is at the disposal of judicial authorities for use in fair and independent proceedings. States can also support initiatives for engagement towards the goals of improving the human rights situation, ending isolation, and advancing the cause of peace on the Korean Peninsula. I encourage your financial and political support for the human rights and accountability efforts of my office and our team in Seoul. Mr. Vice President, distinguished delegates, now I'm providing my update on Venezuela. And since my last update to this Council, the situation in Venezuela has been dominated by the US military intervention on the 3rd of January and its aftermath. In response to that intervention, the Venezuelan authorities declared a state of emergency. The security forces and armed civilian groups reportedly used this as the basis for intrusive measures, contributing to a climate of fear among the population. I urge the authorities to reassess the decree to ensure its necessity and proportionality. At the same time, the Venezuelan authorities have moved to correct some of the wrongs of the past. A new amnesty law was adopted on 19th of February, but I regret that it was drafted without adequate consultation across society. According to the authorities, some 7,700 people have been released unconditionally under the law. My office has requested the official list of those released, as well as unfettered access to several detention centers, but so far without success. I urge greater transparency regarding the release of detainees. We have confirmed that since my last update, some 950 people who were arbitrarily detained have been released, some under strict conditions, including human rights defenders, political figures, journalists, and trade unionists. Prominent figures among those released include Javier Tarazona, Eduardo Torres, Kennedy Tejeda, Carlos Julio Rojas, and Rocio San Miguel. While I share the relief of those who have been freed and their loved ones, they should never have been detained in the first place. I hope this practice ceases forever and that the authorities adopt measures to uphold freedom of opinion, including the defense of human rights. Some 60 prisoners have been able to receive visits from their relatives or communicate with them, whereas previously there had been no information on their whereabouts. Mr. Vice President, throughout this period, structural and systemic human rights concerns have persisted. My office has received information about the continued torture and mistreatment of detainees, including in the civic space remains restricted. Years of repression mean that people fear speaking out. The NGO oversight law still hinders civil society's ability to work safely and freely and needs to be repealed. I hope that the announced review of the constitutional law against hatred will mean that it is no longer used to suppress dissent. Mr. Vice President, Venezuelans continue to face significant challenges in accessing healthcare, water and sanitation services, and food. People in the country are protesting against low salaries, which are insufficient to meet their basic needs. Accordingly, I urge the authorities to ensure full respect for freedom of peaceful assembly. Indigenous peoples still face severe restrictions in accessing their right to health, which contributes to high mortality rates. There has been no progress on the self-demarcation of their territories. Insto a las autoridades a garantizar que todas las reformas económicas y las inversiones, incluidas las que se hagan en los sectores del petróleo, el gas y los minerales esenciales, respeten la soberanía de las y los venezolanos sobre sus recursos naturales. Los ingresos deben utilizarse para promover los derechos económicos, sociales y culturales de todas las y los venezolanos, así como proteger el medio ambiente. Mr. Vice President, Venezuelans are feeling a mix of hope, fear, and uncertainty. Human rights must guide the path ahead, and I would like to highlight 5 key areas for action. First, the authorities need to release all those who are still arbitrarily detained immediately and unconditionally. Second, protecting and expanding civic space. This is essential to repairing the social fabric and strengthening democratic processes. I urge the authorities to enable civil society to work freely, to guarantee their participation in public affairs, and to protect NGOs, journalists, union members, and human rights defenders against threats and attacks. Third, structural reforms to the justice and security sectors. This includes dismantling the legal frameworks and practices that have enabled oppression of political dissent. Such reforms are key to ensuring access to justice and rebuilding trust in institutions. The government also needs to disarm and disband armed civilian groups who have intimidated and exercised control over people. Fourth, ensuring and expanding access to healthcare, food, work, and basic services. I urge the authorities to guarantee adequate salaries, pensions, and other social security measures to cover basic needs and to renew their commitment to labor rights. They also need to demonstrate greater transparency with official statistics on the labor market, food security, and access to health and education. This is essential to building trust. Finally, Venezuelans need to come together and agree on a comprehensive transitional justice strategy. Venezuelan society remains deeply polarized. Healing those divisions requires accountability for all the serious human rights violations committed over the past decades. This in turn requires that all evidence is preserved, even if detention facilities are closed down. Other important steps include institutional reform, reparations, establishing the truth, and guarantees that serious human rights violations are not repeated. These human rights-based confidence-building measures would pave the way for the safe and dignified return of the millions of Venezuelans outside the country. I also urge the authorities to cooperate with all human rights and accountability mechanisms, including the independent international fact-finding mission on Venezuela established by this Council. And I encourage the authorities to reverse their decision to leave the International Criminal Court. I have engaged with the Venezuelan authorities at the highest level, sharing my observations and my office's willingness to support this period. I welcome the decision of the authorities on the 3rd of March to grant visas to my staff. We will need a sustained presence to implement my office's full mandate in support of human rights in the country. At this critical juncture, the country's future must be decided by its people alone. The authorities, the opposition within and outside Venezuela, and all those with political responsibilities need to unite around human rights and put the people of their country first. Thank you.
Muchas gracias al alto comisionado. De acuerdo con nuestra práctica, comenzaremos escuchando a las delegaciones de los países concernidos. Me han informado que la República Popular Democrática de Corea no está presente en la sala. Ahora cedo la palabra al distinguido representante de la República Bolivariana de Venezuela. Tiene usted 5 minutos.
Gracias, presidente. Venezuela ha sido sometida a criminales medidas coercitivas unilaterales desde hace más de 10 años. Más de 1000 mal llamadas sanciones han afectado los derechos humanos de toda la población venezolana. Estudios serios de académicos como el profesor Jeffrey Sachs demuestran cómo esas medidas coercitivas han afectado la salud, la educación, la alimentación, la recreación y otros derechos económicos, sociales y culturales de los venezolanos. El tratamiento que le dio la Oficina del Alto Comisionado a este tema durante varios años fue absolutamente incompatible con las funciones de su competencia. No fue sino hasta que ya era inexcusable no pronunciarse sobre el impacto negativo de estas medidas coercitivas sobre los derechos humanos en Venezuela, es decir, después de la pérdida de miles de vidas, después de pérdidas millonarias, después de una grave afectación a toda la economía nacional que provocó una migración sin precedentes en Venezuela, que la Oficina del Alto Comisionado empezó tímidamente a pronunciarse sobre esta catástrofe. Todo obedecía a que él o los principales financistas del sistema de Naciones Unidas eran justamente los que aplicaban las medidas coercitivas unilaterales contra Venezuela. No era presupuestariamente conveniente cuestionarlas de manera pública, pues ocurriría lo que precisamente hoy está ocurriendo a nivel presupuestario en el sistema de Naciones Unidas. Esta conducta es moralmente cuestionable y la realidad es que llevarán en sus espaldas el peso de la crisis humanitaria que fue inoculada a nuestro país. Con relación a la cooperación con la oficina, es evidente que Venezuela mostró siempre disposición a fortalecer esa cooperación. Sin embargo, la politización y la conducta errática de la oficina al no condenar de manera clara, de manera oportuna, las violaciones flagrantes de los derechos económicos, sociales y culturales de los venezolanos, nos colocó en una situación de cuestionamiento a su conducta. Haber pretendido utilizar el tema de los derechos humanos como un arma de guerra contra el gobierno de Venezuela, buscando un cambio de régimen político, fue un absoluto error. Y hoy está demostrando las consecuencias que esa conducta genera en la esfera geopolítica. Señor presidente, hoy nos encontramos en una etapa en la que debe hacerse una profunda reflexión y rectificación en cuanto a la necesaria observación del derecho internacional y de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas, considerando que los derechos humanos son un...
I'm Aaron Thakkar. I had participated at the 4th International Olympiad on Astronomy and Astrophysics for Juniors held in Romania. I won a gold medal there. It was a really great feeling. I felt that all my hard work and dedication that I had been doing for the past 1 year had finally paid off, and holding the national flag at the international level was a really great feeling. The portion for astronomy is vast, and there is no specified compiled book for astronomy Olympiads. So studying from so many books is not possible. So Narayana provided the required study material. I feel Olympiads are a great level to test your knowledge, your conceptual clarity, and its application, which is very helpful in the long run in all aspects of life, not just your career. Thank you, Narayana.
La nacionalidad, la soberanía sobre los recursos naturales y la historia de las naciones están bajo ataque. Y en esas circunstancias debemos elevarnos al más alto sentido del deber, con base en el ideario de nuestros libertadores, en favor de la existencia política de la nación y la unidad entre los pueblos. Señor presidente, nos encontramos en un proceso de negociación con la Oficina del Alto Comisionado, a fin de que esa instancia pueda contribuir de manera significativa al fortalecimiento de los derechos humanos, no solo en Venezuela, sino en el mundo. Creemos que esto también es una oportunidad para la Oficina del Alto Comisionado en el sentido de rectificar la conducta observada hasta ahora y que esperamos con mucha expectativa que pueda cambiar en favor de la gente, en favor de los derechos humanos y en favor de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias a la República Bolivariana de Venezuela. Excelencias, distinguidos participantes, comenzaremos ahora el debate general sobre el tema 4. Antes de comenzar, les recuerdo que todas las solicitudes de derecho a réplica relacionadas con las declaraciones realizadas durante el debate general se atenderán al final del mismo. También les recuerdo a todos los oradores que respeten el tiempo asignado de 1 minuto y 30 segundos. Las declaraciones completas pueden subirse a la extranet. La lista de oradores se cerrará en 15 minutos. Comenzaremos con la lista de miembros del Consejo. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación de la Unión Europea en nombre de un grupo de países.
Thank you, President. I speak on behalf of the European Union. Iceland, Liechtenstein, Montenegro, North Macedonia, and Ukraine align themselves with this statement. We follow developments in Iran and the Middle East with utmost concern and call for maximum restraint, protection of civilians, and full respect of international law. We regularly condemn Russia's illegal war of aggression against Ukraine and the targeted attacks on Ukrainian civilians. The EU condemns human rights violations in Russia and its intensifying state-sponsored internal repression. Strongly condemning gross human rights violations, we call for immediate release of all political prisoners in Belarus. The EU condemns all violations in the OPT and the further escalation in the West Bank. All parties must facilitate full humanitarian access to Gaza. We strongly condemn the brutal repression of peaceful protests across Iran with thousands of deaths, arbitrary arrests, and the use of the death penalty. We reiterate concerns about the situation in China, including in Tibet, Xinjiang, and Inner Mongolia. Human rights defenders must be released. We urge effective cooperation with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, including towards implementation of the assessment report recommendations. We are concerned about human rights and shrinking civic space in Hong Kong. We reiterate our concerns about deterioration in the areas of democracy, rule of law, human rights, and independence of the judiciary in Turkey. Our full statement is online. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación de Pakistán en nombre de la Organización de Cooperación Islámica.
Mr. Vice President, the OIC Group reiterates its support to the Council's universal mandate and the principles of interdependence, indivisibility, and interrelatedness of all human rights. Proliferating conflict and resort to the use of force are multiplying human rights risks around the world. Only a principled approach to the work of country or situation-specific mandates can preserve this Council's mandated universality, impartiality, objectivity, non-selectivity, constructive international dialogue, and cooperation. Confrontational approaches undermine the Council's mandate and these cherished principles. A hierarchy of rights or situations remains counterproductive. We condemn in the strongest terms expanding aggression by Israel, the illegal occupying power, including against Lebanon and Iraq and in the occupied Palestinian territory. The illegal occupying power's continued aggression poses grave and escalating challenges to human rights and regional peace. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la República Bolivariana de Venezuela en nombre de un grupo de países.
Señor vicepresidente, Venezuela realiza esta intervención en nombre del grupo de ideas afines. Los países con ideas afines rechazan la creciente politización del tema 4 de la agenda del Consejo y se oponen firmemente a las resoluciones impuestas a países específicos que tienen motivaciones políticas y no cuentan con el consentimiento del Estado concernido. Esta práctica selectiva y discriminatoria constituye un doble rasero y viola los principios de universalidad, imparcialidad, objetividad y no selectividad y no politización. La proliferación de mandatos impuestos ha demostrado ser ineficiente e ineficaz. Representa un desperdicio de importantes recursos financieros, lo cual es preocupante, especialmente en el contexto actual de la crisis de liquidez que enfrenta la ONU. Expresamos nuestra profunda preocupación por la proliferación de resoluciones y mandatos bajo la práctica del naming and shaming, que busca interferir en los asuntos internos de los estados, violando los principios fundamentales de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas y del derecho internacional. Finalmente, hacemos un llamado al Consejo de Derechos Humanos y la Oficina del Alto Comisionado a promover un diálogo respetuoso y constructivo y una cooperación genuina con todos los gobiernos, de acuerdo con sus prioridades y realidades nacionales, fortaleciendo el mecanismo de examen periódico universal, evitando cualquier práctica de politización, selectividad y dobles estándares que comprometan la labor de la oficina y del Consejo. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación de Arabia Saudita en nombre del grupo de países árabes.
سيدنا نائب الرئيس، تعرف المجموعة العربية عن إدانتها الشديدة للاعتداءات الإيرانية التي استهدفت كل من الأردن والإمارات والبحرين والسعودية وعمان وقطر والكويت والعراق، وتؤكد أن هذه الهجمات تمثل اعتداءات غير قانونية وتشكل انتهاكا لسيادة هذه الدول وسلامة أراضيها وتقويضا للأمن والاستقرار في المنطقة. وترحب المجموعة باعتماد قرار مجلس الأمن رقم 2817 والذي يدين فيه الهجمات الشنيعة التي شنتها إيران على أراضي دول عربية، ويقرر أن هذه الأعمال تشكل خرقا للقانون الدولي وميثاق الأمم المتحدة وتهديدا خطيرا للسلام والأمن الدوليين، ويطالب بالوقف الفوري لهذه الاعتداءات. كما تدين المجموعة هذه الهجمات الإيرانية والغير قانونية للأعيان المدنية والبنى التحتية بما في ذلك المطارات والموانئ ومنشآت الطاقة والمناطق السكنية والمقرات الدبلوماسية، الأمر الذي عرض المدنيين للخطر وأسفر عن خسائر بشرية وأضرار مادية في انتهاك لقواعد القانون الدولي الإنساني. سيدنا الرئيس، تؤكد المجموعة العربية دعمها لوحدة لبنان وسيادته واستقلاله، وترحب بقرارات مجلس الوزراء اللبناني حول بسط سلطة الدولة اللبنانية على كامل أراضيها بقواها الذاتية وحصر السلاح بيد الدولة ومؤسساتها الشرعية وحظر الأنشطة الأمنية والعسكرية لحزب الله. كما تدعو المجتمع الدولي إلى الضغط على إسرائيل لوقف اعتداءاتها المدانة على لبنان وتنفيذ القرارات الدولية. ونجدد الدعوة إلى إنهاء الاحتلال الإسرائيلي للأراضي الفلسطينية المحتلة وإقامة دولة فلسطين المستقلة على حدود 1967 وعاصمتها القدس الشرقية، وممارسة الشعب الفلسطيني لحقوقه.
Gas on कर दूं?
Presenting India's first Android chimney from Beyond Appliances. YouTube, serials, movies, sports. Ab cooking ke saath entertainment bhi. Beyond Appliances. Engineered to delight.
Thank you, Vice President. The Africa Group recalls the inalienable right to self-determination and the heroic struggles of our peoples for independence, dignity, and economic emancipation. Our resolve to promote and protect human and people's rights predates multilateral fora, and our countries remain committed to strengthening rights and freedoms in line with the UN Charter. Human rights and fundamental freedoms must be respected for all, everywhere, without distinction of race, color, sex, language, religion, opinion, origin, property, birth, or status. In today's global challenges, the Africa Group reaffirms the importance of multilateralism that fosters dialogue and trust, including within the Human Rights Council. As GA Resolution 6251 makes clear, the promotion of human rights must rest on cooperation and genuine dialogue aimed at strengthening states' capacity to meet obligations. Regrettably, politicization in the Council undermines our common goals. It is too often used for political objectives. The Africa Group stresses the Council must function cooperatively, non-confrontationally and objectively while giving due attention to African priorities and initiatives. We call on states to promote solidarity and cooperation, focus on technical assistance and capacity building, and avoid selectivity and double standards. The principles of universality, objectivity, and impartiality must be upheld alongside respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the primary responsibility of states in promoting and protecting human rights.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación de Uganda en nombre del Movimiento de Países No Alineados.
Vice President, the NAM reaffirms that human rights issues must be indeed addressed within the global context through a constructive, non-confrontational, non-politicized, non-selective, and dialogue-based approach in a fair and equal manner. We reiterate that in addressing human rights situations, this Council needs to do so with objectivity and respect for national sovereignty and territorial integrity. The movement reemphasizes that indeed the UPR affords a platform for constructive dialogue and a platform for the Council to review the human rights situation, enhancing cooperation and non-confrontational approach. That, Mr. Vice President, would be done with the consent of the states. The movement remains concerned over the proliferation of the practice of selective adoption of country-specific resolutions in the Council, which is a tool that exploits human rights for political purposes and breaches the principle of universality, objectivity, and non-selectivity in addressing human rights issues. In conclusion, Mr. Vice President, the movement calls upon the member states of the Council to promote international cooperation and constructive dialogue and prevent the occurrence of practices of double standards, selectivity, and political manipulation. The long version is posted on the Extranet. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación de la República Bolivariana de Venezuela en nombre de un grupo de países.
Gracias, presidente. El Grupo de Amigos en Defensa de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas concede la máxima importancia a la promoción y protección de todos los derechos humanos, de conformidad con los principios de universalidad, imparcialidad, objetividad, transparencia, no selectividad, no politización y no confrontación. Destacamos la importancia del respeto a los principios y obligaciones derivadas de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas, incluida la obligación de abstenerse de intervenir en asuntos internos de cualquier Estado. Reiteramos nuestro rechazo categórico al doble rasero en materia de derechos humanos y expresamos nuestra profunda preocupación por la continua y creciente proliferación de mecanismos y procedimientos paralelos de presentación de informes que pretenden realizar evaluaciones supuestamente imparciales de la situación de los derechos humanos en determinados estados. Es inaceptable que se persista en imponer mecanismos intervencionistas y costosos a determinados países sin su consentimiento, a pesar de su demostrada ineficacia y su incompatibilidad con los principios de diálogo respetuoso, genuino y de la cooperación constructiva que deben guiar al Consejo de Derechos Humanos. Finalmente, el grupo condena la agresión militar contra Irán llevada a cabo en violación del derecho internacional. Estas acciones socavan gravemente la estabilidad regional, exacerban los desafíos humanitarios y de seguridad y amenazan los avances logrados en materia de derechos humanos en toda la región. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación de Bahrein en nombre del Consejo de Cooperación para los Estados Árabes del Golfo.
شكرا سيد نائب الرئيس. يشرفني أن أتي بهذا البيان باسم دول مجلس التعاون لدول الخليج العربية والمملكة الأردنية الهاشمية. تدين دولنا بأشد العبارات الهجمات التي قامت بها الجمهورية الإسلامية الإيرانية ضد أراضيها، والتي استهدفت مناطق مدنية وأحياء مدنية وبنى تحتية حيوية، وشكلت مخاطر جسيمة على سلامة السكان المدنيين وعلى أمن واستقرار المنطقة. وتؤكد أن مثل هذه الهجمات تستهدف دول ليس طرفا في أي نزاع، تشكل انتهاكا واضحا لسيادة الدول وسلامة أراضيها واستقلالها السياسي، وتمثل خرقا للقانون الدولي ومبادئ ميثاق الأمم المتحدة، وتهديدا للسلم والأمن الدوليين، ولا يمكن تبريرها تحت أي ذريعة، كما تشدد على حقها الأصيل في الدفاع عن النفس وفقا للمادة 51 من ميثاق الأمم المتحدة. كما أن استهداف المدنيين والأعيان المدنية والبيئة التحتية الحيوية يشكل انتهاكا جسيما للقانون الدولي، بما في ذلك القانون الدولي لحقوق الإنسان وتقويض الحق في الحياة وسلامة السكان المدنيين. وفي هذا الصدد ترحب دولنا باعتماد قرار مجلس الأمن رقم 2817 برعاية 136 دولة الذي يدين بأشد العبارات الهجمات الإيرانية التي استهدفت دولنا، وتطالب الجمهورية الإسلامية بالامتثال الكامل لهذا القرار والوقف الفوري لهذه الهجمات، وتجدد دولنا الالتزام الراسخ بالحوار والدبلوماسية كوسيلة لحل الأزمة، مشددين بالدور البناء الذي تتطلع به سلطنة عمان في هذا الصدد. وشكرا سيد الرئيس.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación de España.
Muchas gracias, señor vicepresidente. España se suma a la declaración de la Unión Europea mientras reiteramos nuestro compromiso inquebrantable con la legalidad internacional. Quiero agradecer al alto comisionado la presentación de su actualización oral sobre Venezuela y sobre, el otro país era República Democrática de Corea. La ausencia de un representante de la República Democrática de Corea en esta sala es, pensamos, una muestra de falta de respeto a este Consejo que no podemos dejar pasar por alto. Todos sabemos que en los 90 segundos que se nos concede es imposible hacer un repaso a todas las situaciones de derechos humanos que requieren la atención del Consejo. Por tanto, nuestra declaración completa está en la extranet. Sí querría referirme, aparte de lo que ya hemos referido esta mañana a Irán y Nicaragua, a algunas situaciones específicas que nos preocupan particularmente. En primer lugar, la que se vive en Gaza y en los territorios palestinos ocupados. Exigimos la restauración del acceso inmediato y sin condiciones de la ayuda humanitaria. En segundo lugar, no podemos dejar de denunciar una vez más la situación que se vive en Ucrania con la agresión ilegal de la Federación de Rusia. Y en tercer lugar, quería recordar las violaciones de derechos humanos que se han producido en Etiopía, en particular los asesinatos de trabajadores humanitarios que deben de ser objeto de una investigación. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. La lista de oradores está cerrada. Cedo la palabra a continuación a la distinguida representación de China.
主席先生，昨天是联大通过建立人权理事会决议20周年。然而，多边主义和全球人权事业面临前所未有的挑战，地区形势深刻影响国际。
Hi guys, this is Alex here, one of the founders of Thalassa. I decided to come up with Thalassa Lux Wellness Realm, and this particular outlet as the realm, because of the energy it's throwing out there. When you as a customer come here and step into this particular outlet, it feels like a realm. It feels like you have entered something totally unique with its natural aesthetic walls, textures, its rounded doors, entry, exit doors, plus the natural lighting that falls on you, the aromas that we handpick to help you understand the relaxation, help you feel that you're somewhere else.
发展中国家耗费数千万美元，真正需要关注的人权问题却没有能够得到足够的重视。欧盟基于虚假信息翻炒涉华问题，就涉疆、涉藏、涉港等问题抹黑中国，中方坚决反对。如果欧盟真正关心人权，就应当检讨自身种族主义、侵犯移民权利等严重问题，就其盟国漠视生命健康权、过度执法、肆意动武等侵权行为充分表达关切。在人权理事会成立20周年之际，各方应以此为契机，重温促进和保障人权的初心，在平等和相互尊重的基础上开展对话与合作，为推进人权事业做一些实实在在的事情。谢谢主席。
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a continuación a la distinguida representación de Chipre.
Thank you. Cyprus aligns itself with the EU statement. We reiterate our strong condemnation of Russia's unprovoked aggression against Ukraine and call on the Russian Federation to immediately cease its aggression and withdraw its forces from the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine. We deplore the continued attacks against civilians and critical infrastructure in violation of international humanitarian law. The escalating situation in Iran and the wider Middle East is of great concern. We condemn the unjustified and indiscriminate attacks against Gulf countries and call for the protection of civilians and full respect of international human rights law. We welcome Security Council Resolution 2817 to this end. We reaffirm our commitment to diplomacy and dialogue as the only sustainable path to de-escalation and stability. Lebanon's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity must be respected. We call on all parties to exercise utmost restraint. In Gaza, we reiterate our support for the stabilization efforts in line with the Security Council Resolution 2803 and its full implementation, which can also create the necessary condition on a political horizon for lasting peace and security. We reaffirm the imperative of safe, unimpeded, and sustained flow of humanitarian aid, including through the Cyprus Maritime Corridor. Finally, we remain seriously concerned about the deterioration of the rule of law, human rights, and judicial independence in Turkey. We call on Turkey to fully implement the judgments of the ECHR and to take urgent measures to address violence against women and girls, including the alarming number of femicides. Turkey must withdraw its troops from Cyprus and commit to a peaceful settlement of the Cyprus issue in line with the relevant UN Security Council resolutions. I thank you.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación de la República de Corea.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The Republic of Korea is gravely concerned about the situation in the Middle East and the risk of further spillover across the region. Attacks affecting civilian areas and infrastructure raise serious concern, particularly regarding the protection of civilians and civilian objects. We urge all parties to comply fully with their obligation under international law, and we hope that the current situation in the Middle East will be resolved swiftly. While concerned about the potential impacts of the current regional escalation on civilians in Syria, we welcome the recent in-country mission of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry and encourage Syria's continued cooperation to advance accountability. In Belarus, we acknowledge the recent release of some political prisoners as a positive step, but note with concern reports of persistent human rights violations and call for the release of all those arbitrarily detained. Regarding Venezuela, we note recent developments, including the release of individuals detained for political reasons and amnesty measures adopted by the National Assembly. While challenges remain, we encourage Venezuelan authorities to engage with international human rights mechanisms and to further advance respect for human rights. I thank you.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación de Kuwait.
سيد نائب الرئيس، بداية يضم وفد بلادي صوته لبيانات المجموعات الإقليمية التي ينتمي إليها. تمر دولة الكويت منذ نهاية فبراير 2026 وحتى تاريخه بفترة حرجة جراء العدوان الإيراني الغير مبرر والمتخبط الذي لا يميز بين أهدافه العسكرية والمدنية ولا يميز أيضا بين جيرانه وأعدائه. وعليه فإننا نشدد على رفضنا التام له وندين محاولاته الآثمة لزعزعة الأمن والاستقرار في دولة الكويت ودول مجلس التعاون باعتباره كل لا يتجزأ. هذا وتعرب بلادي بأن هذا الهجوم انتهاك سافر لكافة حقوق الإنسان باستهداف مباشر للمدنيين أسفر عنه استشهاد طفلة لا يتعدى عمرها 11 عام وسقوط عدد من الجرحى بالإضافة إلى استهداف القوات المسلحة الكويتية وسقط جراء ذلك عدد من الشهداء والجرحى. السيد نائب الرئيس، تدعو دولة الكويت إلى وقف التصعيد لما له من تبعات كارثية على كافة الأصعدة الإنسانية والاقتصادية والبيئية وتطالب إيران بتنفيذ قرار مجلس الأمن رقم 2817 وشكرا.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación de la República Checa.
Mr. Vice President,
With reference to our statements on Ukraine during this Council meeting, we reaffirm the strongest condemnation of Russia's unprovoked and unjustified war of aggression against Ukraine. We further condemn the severe repression of civil society, including human rights defenders, independent media workers, and political opponents in Russia. We urge Russia to immediately release all unlawfully and arbitrarily detained persons. We remain concerned about the human rights violations in China, including arbitrary detention, forced labor, torture, and restrictions on cultural rights in Xinjiang and Tibet. We call on China to end discrimination against minorities and to fully cooperate with the OHCHR and the special procedures of the Council. We urge the authorities in Hong Kong to safeguard freedoms of peaceful assembly, association, and expression. We remain alarmed by systemic, widespread violations of human rights in the DPRK, including total suppression of basic freedoms, operation of political prison camps, and torture of detainees. Regarding Belarus, Iran, and other countries, we refer to our separate national statements. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación de Suiza.
Monsieur le vice-président, la Suisse est profondément alarmée par l'escalade rapide et dangereuse après les attaques militaires des États-Unis et d'Israël contre l'Iran qui violent le principe de non-recours à la force et risquent la déstabilisation du Moyen-Orient. Une violation du principe de non-recours à la force existe également lorsque l'Iran dépasse les limites du droit à la légitime défense, ce qui est le cas pour une partie de ses ripostes. La Suisse appelle tous les acteurs à la retenue maximale et au plein respect du droit international. La Suisse reste profondément préoccupée par la réaction violente des autorités iraniennes aux manifestations de janvier 2026, y compris le recours à la force létale.
My handwriting! Exam time drama.
La Suisse s'inquiète de l'adoption récente par les talibans d'un nouveau règlement de procédure pénale. Plusieurs dispositions y institutionnalisent des pratiques contraires aux obligations internationales de l'Afghanistan, notamment en autorisant les châtiments corporels et en élargissant le recours à la peine de mort. En Chine, nous restons préoccupés par les atteintes aux libertés d'expression et de la presse à Hong Kong. Nous rappelons le respect des droits culturels et linguistiques au Xinjiang et au Tibet et appelons à la garantie effective de la liberté de religion. En Russie, la Suisse reste préoccupée par la détérioration continue de la situation des droits de l'homme. Elle condamne le renforcement des mesures répressives visant la société civile, les médias indépendants et toute forme de dissidence pacifique. Elle appelle les autorités à mettre fin à ces pratiques.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación de Indonesia.
Thank you, Vice President. 20 years after the establishment of this council, Agenda Item 4 has become increasingly politicized. Too often we voice concerns and offer recommendations to an empty hall, while the concerned party disengages or rejects the mandate altogether. In many cases, the situation placed on this agenda decades ago remained largely unchanged, with similar concerns over the years. This should prompt us to reassess how Agenda Item 4 is being used. If this does not lead to engagement or change, the Council must reflect on whether its current approach serves its intended purpose, which is to ensure accountability, genuine engagement, and measurable progress. We must also confront the perception of selectivity and double standards in our work. Human rights become negotiable rather than universal. Domestic matters are sometimes rapidly internationalized, while gross violation of human rights is dismissed as bilateral or internal. Additionally, alliances too often shield impunity. For example, Israel's violations for years in Palestine were dismissed as bilateral matters. Documented killings of civilians, journalists, and reports of sexual violence remain uninvestigated while perpetrators evade accountability. This undermines the Council's credibility, particularly when this agenda item demands a significant share of the Council resources. The Council should avoid normalizing the very problems that destroy its predecessor. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación del Reino Unido.
President.
As the Human Rights Council reaches its 20th anniversary, it is apparent we need this council to address human rights challenges across the globe. We all see the increase in conflict, the shrinking of civic space, the continued oppression of women, which we see most starkly in Afghanistan. The Taliban's new Criminal Procedures Directive embeds religious discrimination, suppresses freedom of expression, and legitimizes violence against women and children. We call for these rules, alongside the numerous other oppressive measures imposed by the Taliban, to be rescinded if the rights of all Afghans are to be protected. On Sudan, the horrendous findings in the Fact Findings Mission report on El Fasher are truly shocking. Ethnic targeting of civilians, mass rapes, communities starved, and aid deliberately blocked. These crimes cannot be ignored. We must act to protect civilians, open humanitarian corridors, and ensure justice for those orchestrating this brutality. We remain unwavering in our support for Hong Kong. We call for the Beijing-imposed national security law to be repealed and for an end to the prosecution of all individuals charged under it, including Jimmy Lai. We also remain deeply concerned about religious and cultural restrictions in Tibet and Xinjiang. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación del Japón.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The peace and stability of the Middle East is of utmost importance to Japan. As a country that respects fundamental values and principles, including human rights and the rule of law, Japan will continue to make all necessary diplomatic efforts in coordination with the international community to bring about an early settlement of the situation. Regarding Russia's aggression against Ukraine, we have witnessed a number of serious human rights violations, including abduction of children. We urge Russia to repatriate abducted children to reunite them with their loved ones immediately. Japan is seriously concerned about the human rights situation in China. Freedom, respect for fundamental human rights, and the rule of law must be ensured in China, including Hong Kong and Xinjiang. We strongly urge China to take further constructive and concrete actions. The abductions issued by North Korea relates to the sanctity of human life and must be resolved without delay, given the aging of the abductees and their families. In close cooperation with the international community, including through the resolution on the situation of human rights in the DPRK, Japan continues to strongly urge Pyongyang to resolve the abductions issues immediately. Japan counts on international community's understanding and cooperation in this regard. I thank you.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación de Eslovenia.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Slovenia aligns with the EU statement. Slovenia remains deeply concerned about the long-standing and systematic human rights violations in the DPRK. Reports of widespread restrictions on fundamental freedoms, as well as information regarding arbitrary detention, enforced disappearances and repression of defectors, and the existence of political prison camps, continue to demand the Council's urgent attention. Slovenia remains gravely concerned about the human rights situation in Myanmar. Violence by the military against civilians and the suppression of fundamental freedoms see no abating after recent sham elections. Organized crime also has detrimental effects on human rights. Continued reports of rising sexual and gender-based violence, recruitment of children by Myanmar military and other armed actors against civilian population are alarming. Slovenia remains deeply concerned about the ongoing and widespread repression of Belarusian citizens and civil society, including those in exile. We urge Belarus to release all individuals unlawfully detained and arbitrary political detentions and ensure the right to a fair trial. We further call on Belarus to cease enabling Russia's aggression against Ukraine. Finally, Slovenia continues to follow closely the developments in Venezuela and calls on the authorities to ensure full respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, including peaceful assembly and freedom of expression. We urge the immediate release of all political opponents, human rights defenders, and journalists. We also call for full cooperation with international human rights mechanisms. All allegations of human rights violations must be thoroughly investigated and those responsible held accountable. I thank you.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación de Etiopía.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Ethiopia reaffirms its unwavering commitment to the promotion and protection of human rights, both nationally and globally. We underscore that the work of this Council must be guided by the principles of objectivity, non-selectivity, and non-politicization. Any deviation from these principles risks undermining the credibility and effectiveness of the Council. Ethiopia acknowledges that ensuring the promotion and protection of human rights is a shared responsibility requiring genuine dialogue, cooperation, and full respect for national sovereignty. To this end, mechanisms established without the consent of the concerned state undermine trust and compromise the Council's credibility. We underscore that responses to the human rights concerns must be country-led, context-specific, and grounded in respect for national ownership. We emphasize the importance of technical assistance and capacity building in strengthening national mechanisms and advancing the implementation of universal periodic review recommendations. Ethiopia reaffirms that the value of multilateral cooperation and the importance of strengthening regional mechanisms that advance sustainable peace, development, and the protection of human rights. In conclusion, Ethiopia firmly believes that fostering genuine cooperation with states, respecting national efforts, and prioritizing dialogue-based approaches are essential to
international law. Palestinians continue to face appalling conditions, particularly in Gaza. Iceland reiterates its call for full, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access. We further condemn recent Israeli decisions to expand its unlawful presence in the West Bank. Iceland reiterates its strong support for the two-state solution. Iceland condemns in the strongest terms Russia's ongoing illegal war of aggression against Ukraine. Those responsible for violations of international law must be brought to justice. In Afghanistan, the institutionalized and systematic oppression of women remains deeply concerning, and Iceland supports efforts to codify these crimes in international law. Iceland reiterates its concern about the serious human rights situation in China, including in Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and Tibet. In Sudan, we are alarmed by the credible reports on war crimes and crimes against humanity bearing the hallmarks of genocide. In closing, Iceland refers to the Nordic-Baltic statements under items 2 and 4. I thank you.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación de India.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. It has been a consistent and unwavering position that the Council must remain free from politicization and polarization. Unfortunately, that goal remains elusive. As we reiterate our call today for a more constructive, non-confrontational, and objective discourse, we invite the Council's attention to its core mandate, promotion and protection of human rights of all. We reiterate that enhancing state capacities through technical assistance and capacity building measures with the consent of the concerned states, coupled with effective implementation of accepted UPR recommendations, represents the most productive path forward. We feel that with continued proliferation of country-specific mandates, the deliberations of the Council under this agenda item have not been conducive to the realization of its intended goals. Selective focus on human rights situations in a few countries not only takes away from the valuable time of the Council, but also diverts attention from a range of critical and pressing challenges that the world continues to grapple with, such as terrorism, conflict, and lack of development. Therefore, we urge the principles of fairness, objectivity, and impartiality be reflected not only in words, but also in the Council's actions. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación de Cuba.
Señor vicepresidente, desde hace 3 meses Cuba no ha podido recibir ningún suministro de combustible. La razón es el bloqueo energético impuesto por el gobierno de los Estados Unidos desde el pasado 30 de enero. Al impedir que Cuba reciba petróleo, Estados Unidos busca paralizar a nuestro país. Quieren cerrar nuestros hospitales, escuelas y fábricas, el transporte público, el abastecimiento de agua y la producción de alimentos. No esconden que su propósito es crear una crisis humanitaria y provocar un estallido social. No hay ninguna razón política, ni ideológica o económica que pueda justificar la privación a un pueblo de sus medios de vida. Eso no es política exterior ni es seguridad nacional. Eso es crueldad y barbarie. Es violación flagrante y masiva de los derechos humanos de un pueblo entero. Denuncio que en Cuba hay niños, ancianos y enfermos que están muriendo antes de tiempo porque el bloqueo impide que reciban sus medicinas y tratamientos. Millones de cubanos tienen que enfrentar cortes de electricidad diarios por muchas horas. Como expresó el alto comisionado sobre el cerco contra Cuba, nada puede justificar la asfixia de una población. No se puede normalizar el sufrimiento de un pueblo entero. No se puede callar ante tanto atropello. El bloqueo es un crimen y el silencio es complicidad. Cuba no pide favores, reclama justicia. El bloqueo mata y debe cesar. Muchas gracias, señor embajador.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación de Estonia.
Mr. Vice President, Estonia aligns with the EU statement. Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine continues in full force and has turned more deadly as Russia continues targeting civilians and the energy infrastructure. The forcible transfer and unlawful deportation of Ukrainian children coordinated at the highest level of the Russian government was qualified as a crime against humanity by the Commission of Inquiry. Estonia also condemns the systematic torture and executions of prisoners of war by the Russian forces and the human rights violations committed in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, including coercive passportization practices. Within Russia, dissent is silenced with systemic violent crackdown on civil society and independent media. Human rights defenders, lawyers, and persons belonging to minorities face unfair trials, long prison sentences, and harsh reprisals. In Belarus, hundreds of NGOs are closed, free media suppressed. The release of political prisoners has been in name only, as their legal status remained unchanged. In Middle East, Estonia deplores the escalation of hostilities and that has dramatic regional and global impact. We urge Iran to refrain from destabilizing activities in the region and in Europe and cease the appalling violence against its own people. Israel has the right to self-defense, but should respect the international law, including in Gaza and in the West Bank, and to fully respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Lebanon. I thank you.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación de los Países Bajos.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The Netherlands aligns with the EU statement. We strongly condemn the continuing Russian war of aggression against Ukraine and Russia's long list of human rights violations, including in the temporarily occupied territories. Russia must stop its aggression, stop its attacks on civilian infrastructure, and release unlawfully detained civilians, prisoners of war, and all forcibly transferred or deported persons. We are deeply concerned about the ongoing escalation and urge Iran to immediately cease this indiscriminate attacks across the wider region. We are alarmed by the renewed internet shutdown and by the widespread human rights violations that persist unabated within Iran. Third, we are deeply concerned about the humanitarian situation in Gaza and the occupied West Bank, which has deteriorated during the last escalation in the region. We call upon Israel to immediately resume unhindered and safe access to the Gaza Strip for humanitarian aid and basic services. New Israeli activities and measures aimed at increasing control over the occupied West Bank are deeply concerning as well. Fourth, we can strongly condemn the horrific human rights violations committed by the warring parties in Sudan. We call upon them to end all hostilities and respect international human rights law and international humanitarian law. The atrocities committed by the RSF and its allies described in the recent fact-finding mission report represents a new low and reminds us why perpetrators must be held accountable. And rounding out fifth, we call on China to implement the recommendations of the UPR, treaty bodies, and the OHCHR Xinjiang report. Freedom of religion or belief for religious communities and faith must be protected.
Cedo la palabra a continuación a la distinguida representación de Francia.
Merci, Monsieur le Vice-président. Alors que la guerre s'empare du Moyen-Orient, la France forme le vœu que le peuple iranien puisse retrouver la paix et accéder à une vie digne et libre. Une solution diplomatique durable est nécessaire pour mettre fin au conflit et pour que l'Iran cesse d'être une menace pour ses voisins et l'ensemble de la communauté internationale. Le régime iranien doit rendre des comptes pour les violations des droits de l'homme dont il est responsable.
I'm Aaron Thakkar. I had participated at the 4th International Olympiad on Astronomy and Astrophysics for Juniors held in Romania. I won a gold medal there. It was a really great feeling. I felt that all my hard work and dedication that I had been doing for the past 1 year had finally paid off, and holding the national flag at the international level was a really great feeling. The portion for astronomy is vast, and there is no specified compiled book for astronomy Olympiads. So studying from so many books is not possible. So Narayana provided the required study material. I feel Olympiads are a great level to test your knowledge, your conceptual clarity and its application, which is very helpful in the long run in all aspects of life, not just your career. Thank you, Narayana.
Et relaie son exigence de justice face aux crimes commis par les forces de soutien rapide, les forces armées soudanaises et leurs alliés. Je vous remercie.
Gracias. El siguiente orador es el distinguido representante de Yemen. Cedo la palabra a su excelencia, señor Nabil Majed, ministro adjunto para los derechos humanos de la República de Yemen.
شكرا للسيد نائب الرئيس. تؤيد بلادي ما جاء في بيان المجموعة العربية وتود أن تلفت نظر المجلس إلى الانتهاكات الجسيمة والمتكررة التي تمارسها ميليشيات الحوثي الانقلابية ضد الشعب اليمني، بما في ذلك القتل العشوائي والتعذيب والتجنيد القسري للأطفال واستهداف المدنيين والمنشآت الإنسانية، وهي انتهاكات موثقة في تقارير الأمم المتحدة وتقارير حقوق الإنسان الدولية. إن هذه الميليشيات المدعومة بشكل مباشر وغير محدود من قبل إيران تمثل تهديدا مباشرا للسلم والأمن الإقليمي والملاحة الدولية، وأداة لتقويض سيادة اليمن واستقراره وتعطيل الخدمات الأساسية وعرقلة وصول المساعدات الإنسانية إلى المحتاجين. كما نؤكد إدانة بلادي للتدخل الإيراني المستمر في شؤون الدول الداخلية ودعم الجماعات المسلحة التي ترتكب انتهاكات خطيرة ضد شعوبها، وندين بشدة الاعتداءات المتكررة على البنية التحتية الحيوية في دول الخليج والدول العربية الشقيقة، بما في ذلك المنشآت النفطية والمطارات والموانئ، ما يعرض المدنيين لمخاطر مباشرة ويجر المنطقة نحو تصعيد شامل. إن المجتمع الدولي مدعو اليوم إلى فرض احترام القانون الدولي على الجميع دون تمييز، وضمان المساءلة عن الجرائم المرتكبة وتجريم انتهاك سيادة الدول والتدخل في شؤونها الداخلية. وفي الختام تؤكد بلادي التزامها بالعمل مع الشركاء الإقليميين والدوليين لتعزيز الأمن والاستقرار وحقوق الإنسان في اليمن والمنطقة بأسرها. شكرا.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación de Letonia.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Latvia aligns with the EU statement. Globally, human rights and international humanitarian law are being eroded. From Afghanistan to Myanmar, Sudan to Haiti and Nicaragua, human rights and the principles of international law are being deliberately undermined. Ukraine has suffered countless losses, including children forcibly deported, war crimes and crimes against humanity committed due to Russia's brutal and senseless war of aggression. Russia must be held accountable. Latvia firmly stands with Ukraine toward just and lasting peace. Iran is also attacking civilians in the Middle East. Latvia stands in full solidarity with both Iranian people and those affected by Iran's attacks. We condemn Iran's threats to regional and international peace and security. Latvia is concerned about the deteriorating human rights situation in Russia and Belarus.
We condemn the expansion of repressive measures and mass human rights violations, including misuse of national security legislation, arbitrary detention and torture. We urge the release of all political prisoners. Latvia remains committed to promoting and respecting human rights and international humanitarian law globally. We advocate for a strengthened multilateral system and international human rights framework, and we uphold accountability, equality, dignity, and justice for all. I thank you.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación de Noruega.
Thank you, Vice President. The protection of children must remain at the center of this Council's work. The Children and Armed Conflict agenda is fundamentally a human rights agenda, as serious violations of international humanitarian law directly undermine children's rights to life, safety, education, and dignity. First, we are deeply concerned about the extremely serious escalation in the wider Middle East, with attacks harming civilians, schools, and hospitals. These attacks must cease immediately. Children must be protected. We are also alarmed by the catastrophic human rights situation in Sudan, where children are being subjected to unrestrained violence, including sexual abuse, killing, slavery, and torture, amid collapsing services and restricted humanitarian access. Russia continues to violate the rights of Ukrainian children, including through forcible transfers and deportations, attacks on schools, and attempts to erase their Ukrainian identity. Norway fully supports the vital efforts of the SRSG CAC to ensure protection of children in armed conflict. The highest number of violations, according to the latest report, was verified in Palestine, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Somalia, Nigeria, and Haiti. We call upon all parties to comply with their obligations under international law to ensure the safety and dignity of children worldwide. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación de Finlandia.
Mr. Vice President, Finland aligns itself with the EU statement. The past year of Russia's over 4-year war of aggression against Ukraine has been the deadliest for civilians. Ukrainians continue to suffer torture, sexual violence, deportations of their children to Russia, as well as worsening living conditions due to deliberate attacks on energy infrastructure. Finland strongly condemns Russia's systemic violations of international humanitarian and human rights law in Ukraine. The war has intensified internal repression in Russia, where human rights defenders increasingly risk their freedom and life. Finland remains deeply concerned about the ongoing repression in Belarus. The escalating situation in the Middle East is alarming. Lasting peace requires diplomacy and readiness to negotiate. Finland condemns Iran's indiscriminate strikes. International law needs to be respected at all times, and we stress the need to protect civilians everywhere. We urge swift implementation of the Gaza peace plan and unhindered humanitarian access. In Afghanistan, the new criminal code is profoundly repressive. It further erodes the rights of women and girls by institutionalizing repression. In Sudan, coordinated international action is crucial. We welcome the appointment of Mr. Pekka Haavisto as UN Secretary-General's personal envoy for Sudan. Finland remains concerned about restrictions in Hong Kong and the erosion of minority rights in Xinjiang and Tibet. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación de la República Islámica de Irán.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The Islamic Republic of Iran strongly condemns the instrumentalization of human rights as a tool to tarnish the reputation of sovereign nations and to create pretexts for political pressure or even military intervention. Human rights must never be exploited as a mechanism for geopolitical rivalry or coercive diplomacy. Iran firmly believes that genuine respect for human dignity cannot be imposed through force, humiliation, or external imposition. True progress in the field of human rights can only emerge through constructive engagement, mutual respect, cultural understanding, and adherence to the principles of national sovereignty and non-interference. Mr. Vice President, at the same time, Iran expresses its profound concern regarding the persistent
politicization and selective approach of human rights discourse by certain Western countries, the credibility of the international human rights framework is seriously undermined when these principles are applied inconsistently or used as instrument of political leverage rather than as universal moral commitments. Today, during the interactive dialogue concerning the human rights situation in Iran, it was striking that Western delegations avoid condemning attacks and invasions against Iran. That is the most egregious violation of the rights of Iranian people. But this delegation were brazen to speak of nonsense issues comparing the war itself. Today, the overwhelming focus and criticism by Western delegations is on the victims rather than the aggressors and violators. Thank you.
Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación de Suecia.
Vice President, the EU and Nordic Baltic countries have raised human rights concerns which we share, including in Afghanistan, Myanmar, and Venezuela. Numerous reports bear witness to Russia's severe systematic violations in Ukraine. We call for the immediate implementation of relevant UN resolutions. Accountability is crucial. The increasing repression in Russia is deeply concerning. We urge Russia to fully engage with UN human rights mechanisms. We strongly condemn Belarus's continued support to Russia's aggression against Ukraine and systematic repression in Belarus. In Sudan, we're deeply concerned by the violence and deliberate mass killings of civilians, torture, arbitrary detentions, and attacks against humanitarian operations and workers. The situation in Gaza remains unacceptable. Israel must live up to its obligations to ensure unhindered humanitarian access and immediately reverse the undermining of the two-state solution through illegal settlement policies in the West Bank. Hamas must disarm and relinquish power. The human rights situation in Iran is deeply concerning. The deadly repression of peaceful dissent and widespread use of the death penalty is alarming. We reiterate our serious concerns about the situation in China, not the least in Hong Kong, Tibet, and Xinjiang. We urge China to implement the recommendations from the UPR, the OHC report on Xinjiang, and special procedures. We continue to demand the release of those arbitrarily detained in several countries. I thank you.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación de Australia.
Vice President, we are deeply concerned about mounting loss of life in the Middle East. We condemn Iran's strikes on civilians and civilian infrastructure across the region and its reported use of lethal force against protesters. Iran and Afghanistan displayed contempt for human rights through the persecution of women and girls, activists and minorities. In the DPRK, we have seen no progress since the 2014 Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights found systemic and widespread human rights violations. We remain gravely concerned by reports of human rights violations and abuses in Myanmar, including the military regime's ongoing attacks against civilians. In Syria, we are concerned by ongoing violence against civilians and call for the protection of all Syria's peoples, including minorities. Israel's illegal settlements severely impact the human rights of Palestinians and undermine prospects for a two-state solution. We want to see the ceasefire in Gaza maintained, civilians protected, and the unimpeded flow of aid. We remain gravely concerned by ongoing human rights violations against Uyghurs and Tibetans. We continue to call for respect for all rights and fundamental freedoms, consistent with the UN expert recommendations. We are also deeply concerned by the broad application of national security legislation in Hong Kong, including to target democracy advocates extraterritorially.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación de Canadá.
Monsieur le Vice-président, le Canada demeure profondément préoccupé par la détérioration continue des droits de la personne. La crise au Moyen-Orient souligne l'urgence de protéger les civils. L'Iran a déjà pris des mesures sans précédent allant des meurtres illégaux, des détentions arbitraires et des actes de torture à l'encontre de sa propre population. Nous appelons toutes les parties à prioriser la protection des civils et à faire progresser une résolution diplomatique. Au Myanmar, les élections générales ont été marquées par de nombreux actes de violence, des arrestations et de l'intimidation, loin des normes internationales en matière d'élections libres et équitables. Au Bélarus, la répression persistante demeure très inquiétante. Arrestations arbitraires, torture, détention prolongée de prisonniers politiques et nouvelles arrestations se poursuivent. En plus, la Russie invoque des accusations de terrorisme et d'extrémisme pour criminaliser la liberté d'expression et toute forme de dissidence, emprisonnant des milliers de personnes dans les établissements où les abus et la torture sont largement documentés. Je vous remercie.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación de Belarus.
Благодарю, господин заместитель председателя. Выступление западных стран в Совете вновь изобилует озабоченностями и обвинениями в связи с положением с правами человека в адрес развивающихся стран. Однако правозащитная система ООН, которая далека от объективности, указывает на серьезные и системные проблемы с правами человека практически во всех этих странах. Отсутствует прогресс в ликвидации проблем дискриминации по многим признакам. Ускоряется процесс отхода от международных обязательств в вопросах регулирования миграции и предоставления убежища. Процветает религиозная нетерпимость. Под предлогом борьбы с дезинформацией закрывается информационное пространство и подавляется, включая методами уголовного преследования, любое альтернативное мнение. Более того, геополитические амбиции элит так называемых правозащитных чемпионов несут кризисы во многие страны через односторонние принудительные меры, которые призваны разрушить экономики путем вливания огромных средств в экстремистские группировки для разжигания противостояний внутри обществ, используя для этого современные технологии. Пока в СПЧ вещи не будут называться своими именами и не восстановится равноправный и честный диалог по правам человека, рассмотрение страновых ситуаций будет только обострять конфронтацию, а не служить цели поощрения прав человека. Благодарю за внимание.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación de Irlanda.
Vice President, Ireland aligns with the statement of the EU. Ireland is gravely concerned at the worsening of the already dire human rights situation in Iran caused by the use of brutal repression, arbitrary detention and the death penalty. Ireland reiterates its condemnation of Russia's violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law as its war of aggression in Ukraine enters its 5th year. The human rights situation in Gaza remains dire. Israel must immediately remove restrictions on aid access, facilitate essential supplies and services, and ensure the full opening of all border crossings. Ireland strongly opposes Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestinian territory, which are illegal under international law. Ireland condemns the systemic exclusion of women and girls in Afghanistan who are denied their fundamental rights to education, employment, freedom of movement, and access to services. In Sudan, the 3rd anniversary of the devastating conflict is marked by serious human rights violations and abuses being perpetrated by the warring parties. Ireland is horrified by the findings of the recent report of the Independent International Fact-Finding Mission. The perpetrators of these violations must be held accountable and brought to justice. Restrictions on civic space, especially in Hong Kong, and the treatment of ethnic and religious groups in China, including Tibetans and Uyghurs, remain of grave concern. We repeat our call on China to implement recommendations from the OHCHR's Xinjiang assessment. Thank you, Vice President.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación de Malta.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Malta aligns itself with the statement of the European Union. We are seriously concerned about the escalating situation in the Middle East and Gulf region. Iran's military attacks on its Gulf neighbors, including civilian infrastructure, serve only to intentionally escalate an already complicated regional situation. We call on Iran to immediately halt all such attacks. We encourage the Democratic People's Republic of Korea to engage with the Special Rapporteur and other special procedures mandate holders. The Special Rapporteur in her report lists several recommendations that would improve the enjoyment of human rights of the DPRK citizens. We remind that individual persons are the rights holders and not governments. Malta maintains its consistent support to all mandate holders and investigative mechanisms. Their priceless work in the promotion and protection of all human rights demonstrate the practical impact of this Council's work on the lives of all rights holders. I thank you.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación de Austria.
Mr. Vice President, Austria aligns with the EU statement. We reiterate our unequivocal condemnation of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, including the ongoing attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure and forced deportation of Ukrainian children. Austria calls on Russia to engage in meaningful peace negotiations and agree to an immediate, full and unconditional ceasefire. We condemn the arbitrary arrests, violence and internet shutdowns during protests in Iran, as well as the disproportionate targeting of minorities, especially the Baha'i. We denounce Iranian regional strikes, urging all parties to de-escalate immediately. Austria calls for a full implementation of the Gaza peace plan, including a ceasefire, humanitarian aid, Hamas demilitarization and IDF withdrawal. We condemn illegal settlements and settler violence in the OPT. A two-state solution remains the only viable path. We remain concerned about ongoing human rights violations in Afghanistan, particularly restrictions on women's and girls' rights, and condemn the persistent human rights violations and gang violence in Haiti, including child exploitation and sexual violence. Austria is alarmed by the findings of the FFM Sudan report that RSF atrocities in El Fasher may signal a genocidal path and calls for stronger civilian protection, accountability, and humanitarian access. I thank you.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación de Alemania.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Germany calls for the protection of civilians in the war in the Middle East. We stand by the UN Charter. We urge Iran to cease its flagrant abuses of international law, causing regional instability through unjustifiable attacks against its neighbors and its long-standing buildup of arms, including its illegal enrichment program. Germany reaffirms the Iranian people's right to determine their future free from brutal repression and abuse perpetrated by the Iranian government. In Europe, Russia must stop its illegal war of aggression in Ukraine, including the latest attacks on energy infrastructure and its human rights violations, as the use of conflict-related sexual violence and the deportation of Ukrainian children. On Sudan, we call for an end to grave and systematic human rights violations, and we will host the 3rd International Conference on Sudan in April. We call on Israel to resume allowing for sufficient humanitarian aid to Gaza, to refrain from any annexation in the West Bank and ensure accountability for unprecedented settler violence. We call on China to respect the universality of human rights, including freedom of opinion, religion, belief, and the press, and the rights of people belonging to minorities, particularly in Tibet and Xinjiang. In Hong Kong, the use of the national security law further erodes civil and political rights. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación de Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Systemic human rights violations continue to pose grave risks to peace, security, and human dignity worldwide. Regrettably, we continue to witness grave human rights infringements in Georgia's Abkhazia and Tskhinvali regions, which are under the illegal occupation and effective control of the Russian Federation, as attested by the decisions of the ECHR and ICC. Torture and ill treatment, violations of rights to life and health, arbitrary detentions and kidnappings, restrictions on freedom of movement, ethnic discrimination, and prohibition of education in native Georgian language have become the inseparable part of the daily life of people residing therein. Despite repeated calls by this Council and the OHCHR, access for international human rights monitoring mechanisms to the occupied regions continues to be denied by the Russian Federation, thus further aggravating the humanitarian and human rights situation therein. Mr. Vice President, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine represents a blatant violation of the principles enshrined in UN Charter and Helsinki Final Act, causing immense human suffering, displacement, and destruction. Georgia reaffirms the importance of the work of the relevant international human rights mechanisms in documenting all gross violations and contributing to the ensuring of accountability. To conclude, my delegation has already expressed its concerns regarding the Venezuela and Nicaragua situations. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación de Bélgica.
Monsieur le vice-président, la Belgique s'aligne sur la déclaration de l'Union européenne. Comme le haut-commissaire l'a récemment rappelé, la menace et l'emploi de la force pour résoudre les différends deviennent de plus en plus fréquents et normalisés. Les souffrances massives infligées aux civils se déroulent sous nos yeux, que ce soit en Ukraine, au Soudan, en RDC, à Gaza, au Liban, en Iran ou dans ses pays voisins. Plus que jamais, nous devons nous rappeler que la Charte des Nations Unies et la Déclaration universelle des droits de l'homme sont nées de la pire catastrophe humaine de l'histoire, la Seconde Guerre mondiale. La Belgique plaide sans relâche pour le respect du droit international humanitaire qui s'applique à tous, en tout lieu, sans exception. La protection des civils dans les conflits armés doit être garantie. Les hôpitaux ainsi que les écoles doivent être pleinement protégés. Le droit international humanitaire vise à protéger les plus faibles et à alléger les souffrances des victimes. Adopter la perspective des victimes, c'est aussi lutter contre l'impunité. Les victimes ont droit à une justice qui identifie et juge les responsables et à des garanties concrètes pour que ces violations ne se reproduisent plus. C'est dans cet esprit que la Belgique défend sans réserve l'indépendance de la Cour pénale internationale. Nous continuerons aussi à défendre ceux qui sont engagés dans la défense de ceux qui défendent les droits. Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Vice-président.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación de Burkina Faso. No está presente. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación de Azerbaiyán.
Thank you. Mr. Vice President, Azerbaijan remains among the most heavily mine-contaminated countries in the world. Large areas of the formerly occupied territories are affected by landmines and explosive remnants of war. It's estimated that more than 1.5 million landmines and an unknown number of explosive devices remain scattered across these lands, posing a continuous threat to civilians. These hazards not only claim and injure innocent lives, but also significantly impede reconstruction, rehabilitation, and the safe return of hundreds of thousands of IDPs. Since the end of the conflict, Azerbaijan has undertaken extensive humanitarian demining operations. However, given the vast scale of contamination, more substantial resources are required, while international assistance to date has been limited. Another pressing humanitarian concern remains the fate and whereabouts of close to 4,000 Azerbaijani citizens who went missing during the conflict. Clarifying the fate of these individuals continues to be a priority for Azerbaijan. In this context, the sharing information regarding the locations of mass graves and minefields would greatly facilitate ongoing efforts to locate missing persons and help bring long-awaited relief to their families. Addressing these humanitarian challenges requires sustained national efforts supported by strong
Gas on kar दूं? Presenting India's first Android chimney from Beyond Appliances. YouTube, serials, movies, sports. Ab cooking ke saath entertainment bhi. Beyond Appliances. Engineered to delight.
Merely suggestions. They are absolute necessities that must apply to everyone without exception. Therefore, we strongly condemn Russia's ongoing war of aggression against Ukraine in a blatant violation of the UN Charter, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the two international covenants on human rights, and other key international treaties. Russia continues to systematically attack civilians and infrastructure, torture prisoners and civilian detainees, and continues the forcible transfer, eradication, militarization, and indoctrination of Ukrainian children. Due to their systematic nature, scale, and gravity, these actions are considered as constituting crimes against humanity. We must ensure full accountability. International aggression and domestic repression usually go hand in hand. Politically motivated persecution of government critics, journalists, and human rights defenders is a daily reality in Russia and Belarus. Developments in Georgia are also deeply worrying. We also find the human rights situation in DPRK, Iran, Cuba, Afghanistan, China, Sudan, and DRC deeply disturbing. Mr. Vice President, Lithuania firmly believes that a stable global order and lasting peace are only possible when fundamental rights are protected and accountability is upheld. I thank you.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación de Maldivas.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Maldives reaffirms its unwavering commitment to the promotion and protection of human rights and remains deeply concerned about ongoing human rights violations across the globe. Mr. President, Vice President, in the occupied Palestinian territories, the civilians continue to endure immense suffering under Israel's ongoing genocide in Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. We call on Israel to end its aggression against the Palestinian people, to protect civilians, and to pave the way to unimpeded humanitarian access for Palestinians. We urge Israel as the occupying power to uphold international law and international humanitarian law, and call on the international community to hold Israel accountable. Mr. Vice President, the world today stands at a perilous crossroads where escalating hostilities and widening regional confrontations threaten not only peace, but the very foundation of our collective security and humanity. The resurgence of militarization and the use of force as a means of settling disputes place countless civilians' lives at risk and undermine the rules-based international system built to prevent such tragedies. The Maldives calls on all states to prioritize diplomacy over aggression and renew their commitment to dialogue, de-escalation, and respect for international law. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación de Turquía.
Mr. Vice President, ensuring stability, security, peace and prosperity of our region is the priority for Turkey. The ongoing war rapidly evolved into one of the most significant geopolitical crises of recent decades. Although the battlefield lies primarily in the Middle East, the war has global strategic consequences. An immediate ceasefire is needed to avoid further devastation in the region. Israel's aggression has become the most serious security problem in our region. We condemned any action that violates international law and endangers the lives of innocent people. Places protected under humanitarian law, such as schools, hospitals, places of worship and water sources, should not be targeted in these hostilities. We will continue to make every effort to end hostilities and to finally build a lasting order for peace in our region. At a time when the world risks being dragged into a war on a global scale, it is difficult to comprehend statements detached from the gravity of the situation and aiming to divert the attention of this august body from the urgent crisis before us. We consider such references directed at Turkey null and void. We renew our calls to the EU to address the rise of racism, Islamophobia, and far-right rhetoric, coupled with increasing restrictions on pro-Palestinian voices, which undermines democratic values. Selective approaches weaken moral authority. Human rights cannot be applied with double standards. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación de la República Bolivariana de Venezuela.
Gracias, vicepresidente. El pasado 3 de enero, Venezuela fue víctima de una agresión militar contraria al derecho internacional y la Carta de las Naciones Unidas. Este hecho en una región de paz no puede ser normalizado. Venezuela denuncia una vez más la politización y la selectividad que rigen la actuación de ciertos miembros de este Consejo, que imponen mandatos contra países, normalmente del sur global, con claros intereses políticos y en franca violación de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas. El doble rasero debe ser erradicado de este Consejo, que transita por una grave crisis financiera al tiempo que se empeña en imponer costosos mandatos que no tienen ningún impacto positivo en materia de derechos humanos y anulan el diálogo y la cooperación genuina. Solo el mandato impuesto por los países occidentales contra Venezuela alcanza casi $10 millones.
भाई शेयर मार्केट पे अच्छी अपॉर्चुनिटी मिल रही है पर फंड्स कम बढ़ गए ना। अरे तो तू एंजल वन पे एमटीएफ कर दे हैं? तू जितना इन्वेस्ट करेगा एंजल वन अप टू 4x तक देगा, अप टू 10 करोड़ पर स्टॉक across 1600 plus stocks. Angel One पे MTF. जब opportunities में conviction हो, funds की कमी नहीं होनी चाहिए. Investments in securities market are subject to market risks. Read all related documents carefully before investing.
China. Muchas gracias, señor vicepresidente.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación de Afganistán.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We express concern over the proliferation of conflicts worldwide, and we reiterate our call on all members to adhere universally and impartially to the principles of the Charter. In the context of widespread and systematic human rights violation under the Taliban, the intensification of cross-border streaks poses an additional serious risk to civilians. This situation requires the immediate and utmost attention of this Council. The conflict has claimed civilians' lives and displaced many people in conflict-affected areas at a pace far exceeding that of the previous years. Mr. Vice President, Afghanistan requires the urgent and sustained attention of this Council. We reiterate our call to the UN member states to fully resource and fund, including through voluntary contributions, the new international investigative mechanism so it can effectively collect, preserve, document, and analyze evidence of international crimes committed and ensure accountability for violations. The people of Afghanistan deserve the renewed commitment of member states to their protection. I thank you.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación de Armenia.
Mr. Vice President, at a time of heightened global instability, Armenia underscores the importance of safeguarding human rights and humanitarian principles as the foundation for peace, security, and sustainable development. Armenia is committed to ensuring that humanitarian considerations remain at the heart of all efforts to build trust and foster reconciliation. In this regard, we remain deeply concerned by humanitarian situation in our region. The release in accordance with international humanitarian law of 19 Armenian detainees held in Baku is an essential element for post-conflict reconciliation and the consolidation of peace. Equally pressing is the need for cooperation to address the fate of missing persons and cases of enforced disappearances. Mr. President, the global human rights landscape is marked by escalating conflicts, rising civilian casualties, and the erosion of fundamental norms. These developments underscore the urgent need for consistent adherence to international humanitarian and human rights law. Protecting civilians, ensuring accountability, and safeguarding humanitarian access must remain universal priorities. At a time when disinformation, polarization, and shrinking civic space threaten the foundations of peaceful societies, the role of this Council is more vital than ever. Armenia reaffirms its support for principled multilateralism and for collective efforts aimed at preventing further deterioration of human rights situations worldwide. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación de Sudán.
شكرا سيد نائب الرئيس. في عالمنا الذي تضيق فيه المسافات وتتداخل فيه القضايا تشهد الكثير من البلدان منها بلادي نزاعات لا ترتبط في استمرارها وتفاقمها فقط بعوامل داخلية بل بأبعاد خارجية وأدوار تخريبية لدول وجهات تتسبب عبر تدخلاتها الضارة في تأجيج النزاع وانتهاكات حقوق الإنسان في بلدان لا تربطها معها حدود جغرافية. لقد ظلت ميليشيا الدعم السريع المتمردة ببلادي رغم سجلها الإجرامي والإرهابي تجد دعما عسكريا وسياسيا وماليا وإعلاميا تضليليا خارجيا مستمرا، وذلك في تجاهل تام لفظاعة الجرائم المرتكبة من هذه الميليشيا، ومنها جريمة الإبادة الجماعية والجرائم ضد الإنسانية وكل أشكال جرائم الإرهاب من ترويع للآمنين وتعدي على المطارات المدنية والاحتجاز والاختفاء من أجل طلب الفدية واستهداف المؤسسات الدبلوماسية وغيرها. إيمانا من بلادي بالتعددية ودور مؤسسات التعاون الدولي تجدد دعوتها عبر هذا المنبر الموقر إلى إدانة هذا النوع من التدخلات الضارة وإدانة نقل وتجنيد المرتزقة للمشاركة في معارك لا صلة لهم بها. إن استغلال المرتزقة يمثل انتهاكا لحقوق الإنسان، لما يمثله من استغلال حاجة أشخاص للمال والعمل والزج بهم في معارك ضد آخرين، في مشهد واضح لاستغلال الإنسان لأخيه الإنسان ومظهر من مظاهر الاتجار بالبشر، هذا فضلا عن الانتهاكات التي يرتكبونها. السودان يجدد دعمه لمبدأ وحدة الصين ويشيد بالتقدم الذي أحرزته الصين في مجالات حقوق الإنسان، بما في ذلك تحقيق التنمية والعدالة الاجتماعية. شكرا السيد نائب الرئيس.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación de Eritrea.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The Council's current practice increasingly raises questions about consistency in how its work is prioritized.
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
Which continue to expand outside the parameters set by the Council's guiding documents and without comparable scrutiny. This imbalance is difficult to understand at a time when the Council repeatedly points to limited resources. The disproportionate attention directed at certain countries risks turning human rights mechanisms into instruments of pressure rather than platforms for cooperation. When mandates are shaped more by political dynamics than by objective need, the credibility of the Council inevitably suffers. If the Council is to retain the confidence of all member states, its work must reflect balance, transparency, and equal treatment in how priorities and resources are determined. A Council that applies different standards to different states weakens the very system it claims to protect. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación de la
Mr.
República
Vice
Popular
President.
Democrática de Corea.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. In the DPRK, all state activities are devoted to serving the people, and the dignity and rights of the people are safeguarded through institutional frameworks, legal protections, and practical implementations. Significant progress has been achieved in all aspects of human rights protection, including improvement of the people's living standards, development of public health, education for younger generation, and provision of housing. In my country, state policies are formulated in the best interest of the people, which are set as the absolute criteria, and are continuously revised and supplemented in accordance with the requirements of development. The urgent issues that the HRC and OHCHR should pay due attention to are the institutional and chronic human rights violations prevalent in Western countries. Issues such as racism, xenophobia, hate crimes, human trafficking, sexual violence, and drug-related crimes remain pressing concerns that demand thorough and genuine efforts to confront and resolve. The issue of Japan's responsibility for its past crimes committed in Asia in the last century also remains unresolved. The systematic and organized war crimes constitute grave crimes against humanity for which no status of limitations should apply. Before concluding my speech, I'd like to reaffirm my country's oppositions and rejection of any attempts to interfere in the internal affairs of the sovereign states such as China, Venezuela, and Belarus, etc. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación de la Federación de Rusia.
Господин председатель, хотел бы вновь привлечь внимание Совета к преступной сущности ненацистского киевского режима, узурпировавшего власть в 2014 году в результате кровавого антиконституционного переворота. Опасаясь, что эскалация на Ближнем Востоке может привести к потере интереса к украинской проблеме и ослаблению поддержки со стороны Запада, Киев делает все для того, чтобы оставаться в западном медийном поле, даже если цена этому жизни невинных людей. 10 марта им совершено очередное чудовищное преступление против мирного населения нашей страны. Нанесен прицельный ракетный удар по Брянску, от которого пострадал оживленный деловой квартал, расположенный вблизи Брянского государственного инженерно-технологического университета, многоквартирных жилых домов, коммерческих и производственных предприятий, учреждений общепита. В результате этой атаки погибли 7 и ранены 42 человека. Удар был нанесен с применением дальнобойных британских ракет Storm Shadow. Зеленский уже публично отчитался содеянным перед своими западными хозяевами, которые несут всю полноту ответственности за последствия данного удара, повлекшего жертвы среди гражданского населения. Также 10 марта украинская сторона преднамеренно нанесла при помощи БПЛА удар по медицинскому учреждению на территории ДНР. Погибло 8 медиков. 10 человек получили ранения. Призываем СПЧ, Верховного комиссара ООН по правам человека и возглавляемое управление отказаться от политики двойных стандартов и дать адекватную, четкую, недвусмысленную оценку этим чудовищным нападениям киевского режима на гражданские объекты. Благодарю за внимание.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación de Ucrania.
Mr. Vice President, we remain deeply concerned about the grave and systematic human rights violations in many regions of the world. Discussions confirm that countries where governments attack their own people and disregard human rights create preconditions to support or enable acts of aggression by states in violation of international law. When fundamental freedoms are denied, civic space is closed, and accountability is absent, the consequences often extend beyond borders and contribute to wider instability. Recent developments in the Middle East illustrate this troubling dynamic. Iranian attacks involving drones and other weapons systems have endangered civilian populations and critical infrastructure in several countries of the region. We express our solidarity with all states and communities affected by such actions. These developments are particularly alarming in light of the growing military cooperation between Iran and Russia. The transfer and use of drones technologies between these two regimes have already had devastating consequences for civilians in Ukraine, where Russian forces continue to deliberately target residential areas and energy infrastructure. Such attacks undermine the most fundamental human rights, including the rights to life, security, and dignity. This reality underscores why the Council must remain vigilant and principled in addressing serious human rights violations.
Narayana Schools unlocks your child's potential to fulfill your dreams. Perfected over 47 years, our age-appropriate curriculum nurtures overall development of students. As one of Asia's largest educational institutions with over 900 campuses across 23 states, Narayana aims to turn your dreams into reality because your dreams are our dreams. Admissions open for academic year 2026-27. Enroll now.
Amidst the ongoing liquidity crisis, but also turned out non-productive, and it should concern us all. The Council needs to address the human rights in a global context, Mr. Vice President, through a constructive, non-confrontational, non-politicized, and a non-selective dialogue-based approach. The unfortunate trend that we witness of alignment with the most powerful and cherry-picking between one wrong over another should not have a place in this Council. Human rights violations anywhere by whomever should be condemned equally by the Council. We agree that 2 wrongs indeed don't make a right, even 3 don't. However, both wrongs must be called out and addressed impartially and objectively. The name-calling and shaming of a select few states under the leadership of the mighty and powerful penholders that are not any innocent to human rights abuses should not be celebrated by this Council, at least not in 2026. Uganda, as the current chair of the non-aligned movement, will maintain a non-aligned principle and non-interference into human rights, into the internal affairs of other countries. However, we remain very committed to cooperating with the Council and productive mechanisms like the UPR that affords us a real chance to promote and protect human rights for all objectively. I thank you.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación de Sudán del Sur.
Mr. Vice President, South Sudan aligns with the African Group and NAM statements. We underscore that as the Council has reached its 20-year anniversary, it should be guided by the principle of impartiality, universality, objectivity, non-selectivity, which were the main drivers for the reform in March 2006. Human rights discussion should promote constructive dialogue and genuine cooperation rather than confrontation or politicization. Respect for sovereignty and national ownership remains essential to achieving durable progress. Country-specific mandates should be subjected for prior consent of countries concerned to ensure the required cooperation. Efficiency and rationalization of the Council is crucial to avoid duplication of work, parallel mandates, and overlapping amid the current global landscape and financial constraints. South Sudan reaffirmed its unwavering support to One China principle and reject any interference in China's internal affairs. In conclusion, we call upon the international community to support countries facing complex transitions, including South Sudan, through technical assistance and capacity building as the best way to promote and protect human rights worldwide. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación de Camboya.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. In today's volatile international environment, Cambodia urges all members of the international community not only to reaffirm, but also to act in full accordance with the purposes and principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter, especially respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states, non-interference in the internal affairs of states, and the renunciation of the threat or use of force in international relations. In this spirit, Cambodia reaffirms its support for the One China principle and its respect for China's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Cambodia emphasizes that matters concerning Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and Xinjiang fall within China's internal affairs and should be free from external interferences. Cambodia supports China's human rights journey and commends China's achievements, which have also made significant contributions to global human rights. Lastly, Cambodia stresses the importance of maintaining social stability, promoting economic development, fostering ethnic solidarity, while ensuring the protection and promotion of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all individuals in accordance with international law. Cambodia urges all actors in the international community to uphold these principles and work constructively towards peace, stability, mutual respect, and shared growth. I thank you.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación de Arabia Saudita.
سيد نائب الرئيس، من أهم الحالات التي توجب اهتمام المجلس هي الهجمات السافرة التي تشنها جمهورية إيران على المملكة ودول مجلس التعاون لدول الخليج العربية وعدد من الدول العربية والإسلامية والصديقة، دول ذات جوار وليست طرفا في النزاع القائم. وترحب المملكة باعتماد مجلس الأمن القرار رقم 2817 الذي قدمته دول مجلس التعاون لدول الخليج العربية والمملكة الأردنية الهاشمية الشقيقة، والذي يدين بأشد العبارات هذه الهجمات ويقرر أن هذه الأعمال تشكل خرقا للقانون الدولي وتهديدا خطيرا للسلام والأمن الدوليين. وتشير بلادي إلى مضامين القرار الذي يدين الهجوم على المناطق السكنية واستهداف الأعيان المدنية وما تسببت فيه الهجمات من وقوع خسائر في صفوف المدنيين وإلحاق الضرر بالمباني المدنية والتضامن مع هذه البلدان وشعوبها. كما تشير بلادي إلى الدعم الدولي الذي يحظي به القرار والإدانات الدولية لتلك الهجمات الإيرانية الغاشمة.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida delegación de los Emiratos Árabes Unidos.
السيد نائب الرئيس، تشن إيران منذ 28 فبراير هجمات غادرة وجبانة ضد دول بذلت جهودا متواصلة لتجنب التصعيد، حيث استهدفت أراضي دولة الإمارات بما يقارب 2000 اعتداء جوي بين صاروخ باليستي وصاروخ جوال وطائرة مسيرة. وقد أدان مجلس الأمن هذه الهجمات السافرة في قراره رقم 2817 بشكل واضح وصريح، وبناء عليه فإن إيران ملزمة بالتوقف الفوري والكامل عن هذه الأعمال العدوانية. ومن هذا المنبر نؤكد أنه لا يمكن لدولة الإمارات قبول توسيع نطاق الحرب على حساب أراضيها، وأن أي مبررات إيرانية لتبرير هذه الأعمال العدوانية مرفوضة رفضا قاطعا. السيد نائب الرئيس، إن لهذه الهجمات غير القانونية تداعيات خطيرة على التمتع بالحقوق الأساسية، وعلى رأسها الحق في الحياة والأمن، والحق في الصحة، والحق في مستوى معيشي لائق. وبالتالي تؤكد دولة الإمارات أنها لن تتهاون في حماية أراضيها وسكانها، كما تحتفظ بحقها الأصيل في الدفاع عن النفس وفقا للقانون الدولي. وفي الختام، تدعو دولة الإمارات هذا المجلس إلى إدانة هذه الانتهاكات الصارخة للقانون الدولي الإنساني، ورفض كافة الأعمال العدوانية التي تهدد الأمن والاستقرار الإقليمي. شكرا السيد نائب الرئيس.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación de Kazajstán.
you.